guys, and welcome to my worm farm, which is based on my flower farm in East Yorkshire in the UK. And the reason I have so many worms in boxes behind me is because I think they are so great for the soil. So I'm trying to breed and grow as many worms as I can so that I can add this amazing vermicompost to my soils on my flower farm and hopefully improve plant health, flower production and plant immunity and all those good things that vermicompost help out with on farms, gardens and things like that. So I thought I would give you a little bit of a tour of what's been going on. I've had my worms since January 2022, so I've had them about 10 months and I've learned lots of things along the way. So I wanted to share a few of those things with you guys today. I want to let you know how I'm feeding them, what I do to sieve the vermicompost away from the worms, and also the mistakes that I've made and how I've rectified them, and yeah, just a general overview and a bit of a tour of the different setups that we've got in here. So I've got these polystyrene bins behind me that have breeding worms in them, and then I have another setup which I made a video about initially, which is a box system where the worms live, and then I've also got a big IBC tote that is just kind of like a big bin that I just like dump things into, and the worms seem to love it. So let's get started by telling you a little bit about these polystyrene boxes behind me. In these polystyrene boxes I have two breeds of worms. I have tiger worms, which is Eisenia fetida, and I also have some dendrobenas. I think they're also known as either African night crawlers or European night crawlers. And the reason I've got two types of worms is because I eventually would like to be able to sell these worms for fishing, and dendrobenas are a good fishing worm for fishermen. I've got a mix of, I think it's about 50-50 tiger worms and dendrobenas. I haven't found a major difference between the both worms, except maybe the tiger worms breed a little bit quicker, the dendrobenas get a little bit larger, but mainly there isn't a difference between them, so I wouldn't worry about that too much if you're thinking about using them for composting. Each of these initially I think had about between 500 and 1,000 worms in. And we started off with a mixture of coir and well-rotted horse manure as a bedding material. Worms need a bedding material that has good moisture retention, so I chose coir and well-rotted horse manure because I thought the horse manure would be quite a good biological kickstarter. The horse manure had been sitting out in our fields for 2 years, so I knew it was well rotted down. We made sure that the bins were nice and full of the initial bedding material, and then we just dumped the worms on top, and then we used it's underlay. We used this underlay as a cover on the worm bins because worms don't like the light, so we constantly have the lights on in here to keep the worms in their bedding. If all the lights went out, the worms would start crawling all over the place, so we have to keep the lights on all the time. However, we want the worms to come to the surface to feed, so I put this cover on to allow the worms to come to the surface underneath the underlay, and they will feed underneath that, and the gap that is around the edge of the bedding material prevents them from escaping out of the bedding. So they'll come to the middle of the bed, but they won't venture to the edges where the light shines because they don't like the light very much. So then what we have been doing lately is adding a layer of wet cardboard to the top of the worm bins, and that has really helped recently for moisture retention and just general worm happiness. They seem to really enjoy the wet cardboard, so that's going to be something that we'll continue to do in the future. And we have lots of Amazon delivery boxes laying around here, so we don't have a shortage of cardboard to be doing that with. So when we started with the worm farm, I was feeding them with layers pellets, or like a chicken food. So this is the kind of stuff that I was feeding them, and we are using a grinder to grind it up into fine pieces. So the worms can feed on a very small particles, or they feed on the microbes that are breaking those particles down. So worms have extremely small mouths, and they're not necessarily feeding directly on what you give them. They're feeding on the microbes that you are kind of cultivating within the worm beds. So we were grinding this down really fine just so that it breaks down really quickly. It's got a high protein content, so it'll fatten up the worms and hopefully keep them happy. However, I will get on to the reason why I've started changing this up a little bit, because it did cause some problems within our worm bedding. So what I would do is grind this up into a container like this one, and then I would just go along with the tub and just sprinkle kind of a small handful at a time on top of the worm beds. And you just have to use your intuition to see when the food has sort of disappeared and when the worms look hungry again. You'll get to know what the worms like once you've had them for a while. So usually you can just keep an eye on them, and you can kind of tell when they start looking hungry. They start migrating out towards the edges of the beds and things like that. So once you sprinkle some food in, give them a bit of water, then when you come in the next day you'll see that it's just like a frenzy of worms, and they absolutely love just getting in amongst all of that food. So what happened in my situation was that I think we overfed the worms, and I think we were feeding them too much with this grain which was kind of fermenting inside of the worm beds, and it caused a thing called protein poisoning or string of pearls disease. And I'm not 100% sure what happens, but I think because the worms are eating food that is being fermented, the fermentation process is letting off gases inside the worm's body, and it kind of causes, as you can imagine, it's called string of pearls disease. It kind of causes the worms to look like a string of pearls, and once worms have this, it's kind of a death sentence. They're not going to come back from it. So I noticed that the worms weren't looking particularly happy. There was quite a lot of them dying off, and a few of them I spotted had this string of pearls disease. So that's what led me to believe that I was overfeeding them. The food was kind of fermenting in the beds, and the worms weren't very happy. And then there was occasions where I did put food in and the worms weren't eating it, and it was going bad. So in that case I should have really removed the food and just stopped feeding them for a while and maybe changed the bedding. I did do a test on the pH, and I noticed the pH was slightly low, and at that point it kind of got to a bit of a crisis with the worms. So I decided to sieve all of the worms out and change the bedding so that they had fresh bedding, and I didn't feed them for a while just to let them kind of get used to their new environment. Plus the new bedding that I gave them was kind of, so when I was building the new shed in my front flower field, I was kind of composting but kind of not, and there was a section of this compost pile that I had which was quite well broken down, so I decided to use that as worm bedding, and then I mixed it in with some alpaca poo and some other things that I thought would be good for the worms. So I gave them some fresh bedding, and those kind of things that are contained within the worm bedding, like the alpaca poo, also acts as a feed material. So then I switched up the feeding a little bit, and I started to mix in some more eggshells into the feed and also some more alpaca poo. So now I'm feeding them with a mixture of chicken food, eggshells and alpaca poo, just to give them a bit more variety. And also if we have things like cardboard, we chuck that in, and the worms are quite happy to feed on that. So I think since we've sieved out the worms and started feeding them slightly differently, I think that they're a lot happier. And what my end goal is to be able to feed the worms some composted material that I've made out in the field. So now that I'm working on building good compost piles, I'm hoping to feed the worms my composted material, and hopefully they're just going to super boost that compost by adding their lovely worm castings to it. So at the moment I'm feeding the worms about once a week, or maybe just over once a week, and they seem happy with that schedule at the moment. At the same time as feeding, I will also water the worms. So I use my backpack sprayer just to spray a little bit of water on the worm beds, because you want it to be a nice moisture level in there, because worms do breathe through their skin, so they need to have contact with moisture at all times to be able to breathe. So you can't use tap water directly with the worms because the chlorine kills microorganisms that we want within our vermicastings and also within the worm's gut. So we really don't want to be putting chlorinated water on the worms. That's a big no-no. You can leave the water to stand for 24 to 48 hours to allow the chlorine to gas off. But if you always forget about doing stuff like that, like I do, then you can mix it with humic acid. So humic acid ties up the chlorine in the water, so that's usually what I do. So I totally forgot to tell you about this side of the racking system. So here are all the adults of the tiger worms and the dendrobinas, and over here we have the babies and the eggs. So this is kind of like the nursery racking, and these are the adults. So initially when we set up the worm farm, we were sieving the worms out every month, which I'll get to later. I'll show you how I'm sieving the worms. We're sieving them every month, and that gave the worms a chance to produce quite a lot of eggs. And then we were putting the eggs into these trays and keeping them watered in the hopes that they would hatch and we would have big boxes of baby worms. However, it kind of didn't really work out the way that I expected it to. I found that we left some of these beds for a little bit too long. We left them over a month, so I think we left them about 2 months, and we found that the eggs were hatching really quickly in these adult beds compared to in these egg beds. So I think in the future we're probably just going to let them breed within these bedding systems rather than these, because I find that they don't really hatch or grow very quickly in this kind of situation. I'm not really sure why that is, but we've tried it and we know, so we're going to maybe pivot and do something a little bit differently. So that is the feeding, the watering, and briefly talked about the setup behind me. I will just move the camera around and chat to you about my initial beds that I set up and also my IBC that I've got in the corner over here. These beds are the ones that I set up initially, and in hindsight I didn't really need to kind of create all of this, although it is kind of like a handy table to have for storing these turf boxes in. And I haven't really used them in the way that I intended to use them because I haven't been adding material to these. I've just been feeding them the same thing that I've been feeding these polystyrene box worms behind me. So the initial idea for these boxes was to fill them up with a starter amount of bedding material and then just keep adding bedding to them and allowing the worms to consume it and make vermicompost. So I was going to let these boxes fill up, and then I was going to stack another black box on top of them with bedding material and food in it and allow the worms to migrate upwards into the fresh bedding material, and after a few weeks I could take the bottom box away and that would just be worm castings free of worms. However, it's not really worked out like that because I haven't been adding to it. I'm not really sure why. I think I just got carried away with these polystyrene boxes here, but maybe it's time to start adding a bit of composted material and things like that to it and getting these boxes going again. So these boxes did actually suffer quite badly with the protein poisoning problem that I had, and I had lots of worms die off in these boxes, and I haven't actually changed the bedding in these boxes either. But the positive point to this is that there are lots of worm babies in these beds, so I'm happy that although a lot of the adults have disappeared now, the babies are in there and they are growing away, so they are obviously still liking the conditions in there. The third setup that we have on the worm farm is this IBC, and this seems to be working quite well so far. This is full of dendrobina worms, so when we started having problems with the protein poisoning, we dumped a lot of worms in here just to give them some fresh bedding and kind of use this as a bit of a hospital bay, a bit of an emergency room kind of thing. So the worms in here seem quite happy. We do sometimes just dump things in here, like I've put some sedum leaves in here, and then we've got some cardboard and stuff in here, and the worms seem quite happy to chomp their way through it. So the sedum leaves that I've put in here I won't feed the worms again until they've gone through that kind of stuff, because I'm mindful now of overfeeding the worms and I don't want to give them too much to eat and cause anaerobic conditions and things like that. But they seem quite happy at the moment, just chomping away on the cardboard and the sedum leaves, and there's also lots of worms and worm eggs and worm babies in there. So we'll probably continue to fill this bin with food, and then eventually we can dig out the worms and harvest this as worm castings. One of the other issues I've been having on the worm farm is, probably you can see behind me here, we did have a problem with mice at one point. So we were getting mice in here, and because we were feeding them chicken food, the mice were burying themselves underneath the underlay that we were putting as a covering on top of the worm beds, and they were feeding themselves on that, all of that chicken food. So they were causing a bit of disturbance inside the worm beds. I don't think that they were actually eating the worms or the worm babies or anything like that. I think they were just interested in the chicken food. But at the same time that we had the mouse problem, we were also having the problem with the protein poisoning and the worms dying off and things like that. So it was kind of just like a culmination of lots of different problems all at once, and we were quite sort of concerned about the future of the worm farm at that time. But luckily we've got things under control now. We managed to catch all of the mice, and we've put some expanding foam into the areas where we thought the mice were getting in, and we haven't had any problems with those since, which is good. So, like I said, I am going to show you how to sieve out the worms and get the vermicompost from the worms. So I've used the vermicompost in various applications. So I'll use it as an inoculation for seeds. So if you watched last week's video of me cover cropping some of the flower farm, you'll see that I inoculated the cover crop seed with worm castings, which just adds that initial biological element to the seeds, and hopefully that will help us to grow really healthy plants. And then I also mix it into my potting mixes and my seed start mixes. So I'll mix about 20% worm castings with my seed sowing medium, and that just helps to put that initial biology into the plants and around that root zone. The other thing is, at the moment I'm making extracts from vermicompost. So I will put the worm compost in kind of a mesh bag and agitate it into some water, and then I will spray that onto the soil or water it into the soil just to add some biology to the soil. And next week I will be setting up my new compost tea brewer system, so I'll be making worm compost tea as well, and I'll show you all about that next week when we get into that. So what I'm going to do now is take you back to a clip that I filmed last week, which is a worm sieving video. So I'm going to sieve out the worm compost and just show you how I'm separating the adult worms from the baby worms from the vermicompost. So here I have brought my worm tray in that I want to sieve, because there's a bit more lighting in here, and also I'm currently without a table in the worm rooms to sieve on. So what I'm going to do is sieve the worms through two different mesh sizes. This one's 3/8 of an inch, and I actually can't remember the diameter of the mesh on that one, but if I can figure it out, I'll put it on the screen. So I'll take a handful out of my worm bin that I'm wanting to sieve. Then I'll use this 3/8 of an inch mesh to sieve here, and that will sieve out the smaller pieces of worm bedding, the smaller worms and the worm eggs, hopefully the worm babies as well. And then here I will dump all of the worms into this bed here. So I'm going to put my fresh bedding into this bed, and that can be their new bedding ready to go. And then once I'm finished sieving those, I can sieve this again, and I can get the worm compost and the worm eggs separated. So in front of me I've got 3 trays. I've got my worms ready to be sieved, I've got an empty tray, and then I've got another tray here which is where my adult worms are going to go. So what I'm going to do first of all is to tip some of the new bedding into this end end bay here, and as you can see there's lots of nice mycelium and fungal hyphae in there, so hopefully that's going to be a really good vermicompost by the end of it. A handful of worms. And as you can see, most of the worms have stayed in the top here. There's also a few eggs that are just clinging to some bits of the worm bedding, but I'm not too concerned about that. So all of the adults go into the new bed, and then I usually just go by hand and pick some of the ones that have fallen through the mesh and put them into the new bedding. This is empty now. This was originally the worm bed, and then we've got this one here that is full of worm castings and worm eggs and some small baby worms, and then we've got this bed here which has got the new bedding and the adult worms ready to carry on their lives in this new bedding. So what I'm going to do now is set this one aside, and then I'm going to sieve this one again. So I'm using my very fine mesh now, the finest mesh that I've got. And, oh, there's a big worm there. And I'm going to take this vermicompost slash worm, small worm slash worm eggs, and I'm going to sieve it in here. So once I think I've shaken it enough, I am left with chunkier bits of worm compost, eggs and babies. And I can't actually see any babies in there, so we've got a really nice fine vermicompost in there, and then we've got the eggs and things. So I can either choose to put this into a separate box so that the worms and the babies can grow on and hatch, the worm eggs can hatch and grow on, and the babies, or I can just put them back in with the adults and allow them to continue growing in there, which is what I think I'm going to do today, because at the moment we're not keeping on top of putting the worms into new bedding and things, and I actually think that they hatch better and grow better when they are amongst the adults. I'm not sure why that is yet, but I'm sure we'll find out at some point in the future. I've got the worms sieved out and they're all happy in their new home, hopefully. And then I've got a nice full tray of worm castings that I can use now for worm extracts, worm teas, and mixing into my seed mixes. And also I'm going to be inoculating my cover crop seed with it today. One really important thing to remember to do is to label the trays. So I've just labelled this one tiger worms, and then I've put the date on it so that I know when they got the new bedding and when they were sieved out, so that I know when they're due for a refresh, probably in a month or so time. So I think I've covered everything as far as the worm farm update goes. We've had lots of successes and failures with the worm farm, but I think that using the vermicompost on the farm is going to bring great benefit to the plants, and hopefully going to give us really healthy soils and things like that, and I'm just really looking forward to seeing it under the microscope. And my brand new microscope is coming tomorrow, so I'm really excited to share some of the insights with you guys here on my channel. So if there's anything that I have left unanswered for you guys, if there's any questions that you have, then don't be afraid to put them in the comments and I'll get back to you on those and I'll answer them if I can. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.